Now we're going to move on to perhaps the richest part of ASL morphology, verbal morphology. Verbs, as you know, are action words, words that show doing. And we've already mentioned how verbs can take lots of types of morphemes. That is, you can bind certain types of facial expressions as well as certain types of movements to verbs. And today we're going to talk about the different categories of verbs that take different types of bound morphemes. Now, in English, there are certain bound morphemes that can be added to certain words and other morphemes that can't. For example, if you want to make the verb establish into a noun, you can't say establish shun, you have to say establishment. But if you want to make the verb populate into a noun, you can't say populatement, you have to say population. So certain types of words take certain types of endings. Well, it's the same way with ASL verbs. Certain types of verbs can take certain types of bound morphemes. Now, some verbs don't take any bound morphemes. Verbs like have or think or know, they can't be inflected in any way. You can't change their movement to change what they mean. If you think of the sign have, you can't form it in a circle to mean have for a long time. You can't sign it in different areas to mean you have or I have, or to mean have something in a particular area. The sign think, similarly, has to be signed at the forehead. Notice here I'm talking about the sign think, not the sign think about or consider. Two different signs. That sign can be inflected. Um, so these are plain signs. Now, verbs that show length of time inflections are verbs like write, work, type, or postpone. Those words can be modified in such a way that they show write for a long time by making a circular movement, or work for a long time with a circular movement, or type again and again with that rapid back and forth movement that changes the meaning to mean again and again, or postpone again and again by that repeated motion. So these types of verbs do inflect to a small degree to show you what's called aspect. That is, whether something's happening once, continuously, or repeatedly. Now, as we move down the list, we can see certain verbs that are sometimes called directional verbs, but as linguists, we're a little more specific than that. Some of these verbs show where things happen. Verbs like go, or drive to, or post on a wall, or hurt. These verbs are called locative verbs because they tell us the location of something. And these verbs are also able to inflect for length of time. So you can take the sign go and mean go and again, or go continually. You can sign hurt for a long time or hurt repeatedly, as well as moving these verbs to show different locations. Now, depicting verbs are probably what you were originally told were called classifiers, and these verbs operate in a similar way. They operate in free space, so they can be modified not only to show where things are happening, but also to show the aspect or the length of time that something's happening. Now, don't confuse those types of quote-unquote directional verbs with what we call agreeing verbs or indicating verbs. Now, agreeing verbs and indicating verbs operate very similarly to these other spatial verbs, but with agreeing verbs, they're not showing where things are happening, rather they're showing to whom things are happening and who is doing things. They show the subject and the object of the verb. Who does it and who do they do it to? So these verbs, verbs like tell and inform and tease and yell at, can be modified to show who is doing them one to another. And they can also be modified, like all the verbs above in the list, to show the length of time, whether it happens once, for a long time, or repeatedly. And then we sometimes have verbs that fall into a category that's difficult to label. These verbs that some people seem to think you can use in an agreeing way, and some people don't, or that can be used to agree with certain subjects and objects, but not with others. So take the verb to see, for example. Well, if I see you, I can move that verb from me to you, but I would never move that verb from you to me to show you seeing me. It has to start at the face and move outward. So I can modify the verb to a certain degree to see a person on the right or see a person on the left, but it has to start at my face. I can't say that one person sees me with a simple movement of the verb. Similarly, ignore has to start at the nose. So if he ignores me, it still starts at my nose. So I can't modify it fully to show he does it to me. So these are what are called semi-inflectional verbs, or verbs that are able to take on certain inflections and certain morphemes, but not all of them. So make sure that you're able to understand how some verbs cannot change their movement at all, plain verbs. Some can change their movement only to show aspect or length of time. And some change their movement to show location or to show agreement, who does what to whom. Now, as we look at these types of verbs, there's one particular type of verb that can be a little confusing. It's an agreeing verb or an indicating verb. The two words mean the same thing, but it moves in the direction opposite of what you would expect. These are called backward verbs. So if you think about it, most agreeing verbs move from the subject to the object. If I give to you, then the sign give moves from me to you. Or if I look at you, then the verb moves slightly from me toward you. That's I look at you. But backward verbs are different. They move from the object to the subject. So if I summon you, then I start with my hand farther out and pull it back to me. So it's moving from you, the one being summoned, to me, the one doing the summoning. I summon you. Or if I hire you, then it moves from you to me. If you hire me, then my hand moves from me to you. So be aware that certain verbs, these backward verbs, don't move in the way you'd expect, but they're still agreeing or indicating verbs because they still show who does what to whom. And as such, they can still be modified to show aspect, to show repeated motion, or to show continual motion.